Okay, welcome to the Backyard Professor videos. This one is for everybody. There's no doubt about it. This is something I've been wanting to do, but it's specifically for Wayman29. Hey Wayman, buddy. How you doing today? I promised I would show you a couple of examples of how you asked the question about the vignettes, the little pictures in the Egyptian documents that wouldn't match the inscriptions, and so you were asking for some ideas. My first one comes from Hugh Nibley in his book, The Message of the Joseph Smith Papyri in Egyptian Endowment. It's a huge book. It's like 600 pages. It's $60. Pretty expensive, but very well worth it. Actually, it's $49, but anyway, on pages 4, 5, and 6, he's talking about this idea that the common Egyptian practice of matching vignettes with texts, they don't do it all the time. In his particular edition of the Book of Breathings, based on the Papyrus Louvre number 3279, Jean-Claude Goyen warns the student that the vignettes that accompany the text have often only a very remote connection with the substance of the writing. For example, illustration 2 of this breathing text actually belongs to the illustrations of the chapters of the gates of Hades in the Book of the Dead, he says. And it is only as an exception that the title of the text under illustration 4 corresponds to the drawing that adorns it. And then Nibley goes on to say that the actual illustration is in the Joseph Smith Papyri itself, where we have the facsimile number 1 text, or picture, the vignette, but the text in front of facsimile 1 and the text surrounding facsimile 1 have nothing to do with facsimile number 1. And he says that on page 5. He says, only by matching up the fibers of the writing and the drawing is it possible to show that the two presentations, facsimile 1 in the Joseph Smith Papyri and Papyri number 11, they have nothing to do with each other. They were actually side by side on the very same strip of papyrus. I thought that was interesting. And then he has go to page 28 and 29 where he's talking about the ties with Abraham and how the saints were taught to associate Abraham with these Egyptian fragments and manuscripts. But what I want to do is I want to show you, he shows an example of this that I want to take a moment to show you real quick. This is completely rookie-ish, but oh well. I'm going to try to do this real quick so that I can show you this. Here, I'll just do it this way. I'll just hold it. This particular papyrus, this illustration here, the caption down here says vignette, or figure number 16A right there. It says, this is with Papyrus Louvre 3284, flanking column 6. As is so often the case, the vignettes seem to bear no relationship to the text accompanying them. One can make a connection between the vignettes on the right, these ones, and the text from columns 4 and 5 to its right. These derive from chapter 125 of the Book of the Dead, but the connection between the vignette on the left, this one, which is the standard vignette of this type of Book of Breathings, and the adjacent text is obscure, he says. So there's an actual pictorial example of this going on, where the text does not match the vignette. And I wanted to show that example, but Nibley's not the only one who claims this. John Gee, also, he's the LDS Egyptologist who works really extensively with Egyptian materials. This is in his book, The Astronomy, Papyrus, and Covenant. It's edited by John Gee and Brian Hauglid. If you can get this book, it's pretty good. It's in the Studies in the Book of Abraham, number 3. And it's by the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies. This is 2005, so it's not that long ago. But Gee, in facsimile 3 in the Book of the Dead, chapter 125, the main contention is that facsimile 3 is just a funerary document. And he shows how facsimile number 3 is usually classified as a vignette of chapter 125 of the Book of the Dead, and that it represents a constantly recurring scene in Egyptian literature. But he says, and technically the The theme is the judgment scene before the throne of Osiris. And that's what our facsimile number 3 in the book of Abraham has been judged to be. He says, however, there is no consistent association of the vignette depicting the judgment of the dead with the Book of the Dead until after the 19th dynasty. Originally, this wasn't an illustration of chapter 125 in the Book of the Dead, and I thought that was interesting. After the 26th dynasty, the judgment of the dead vignette is consistently attached to the Book of the Dead, chapter 125. And other texts were originally associated with this. Thus, the argument usually advanced by critics of the Book of Abraham that because a vignette from a text is similar to a vignette from a funerary text, it must be, therefore, retain its full funerary meaning. That's a false argument. The argument is these are just funeral documents. But chapter 125 of the Book of the Dead, with its vignettes, may not be funerary. That's part of Guy's point. He says, the facsimiles of the Book of Abraham do not belong to the Book of Breathings. And then he describes what facsimile number 3 is not. This is on page 99 and 100. He says, the problems with the theory that facsimile number 3 is the vignette from the Book of the Dead 125 can be readily shown by a single quotation from the latest known copy of the Book of the Dead, written in Demotic in AD 63. It says, this Book of the Dead has no vignettes, and yet it writes about a description of a vignette. And when it writes that description of the vignette, it doesn't match what facsimile 3 in the Book of Abraham shows. So he's saying they are describing a completely different vignette, so this one doesn't belong to chapter 125. Does that make sense? Anyway, if we compare the description with facsimile number 3 in the Book of Abraham, we find that the description does not match at all. And so he says, and he's discussing the various elements of the description of the Book of the Dead. And I'm not going to go into that with you. He says, though, the elements that are present in a vignette accompanying the Book of the Dead, chapter 125, found among the Joseph Smith papyri, as well as other copies of vignettes of the Book of the Dead, chapter 125, they are different. It's very interesting how he compares the different facsimiles, showing that a description of a vignette is about a vignette that does not match facsimile number 3 as a funerary judgment scene. So I think that's kind of interesting. Now, the real kicker